Well, we're almost done with the buttons and dials. We've just got a few more here on the back. As we're moving across the camera, right next to the viewfinder, you're going to notice this little lever. What that does is that actually closes or puts a shutter over the back of the viewfinder.
Now, why would I ever want that? Why would I not want to be able to see through the camera?
That's a great question. When you're shooting in any of the automatic modes and your eye is not right up to the camera, say you're on a tripod, if any extraneous light's coming through the rear of the viewfinder, that can actually impact your exposure adversely. So when you know that you're going to be standing away from the camera, you can simply get everything composed, set up, ready to go, close that little lever, and keep shooting. And then you just simply release it once more if you want to look through the camera.
So like if I'm using a remote shutter release,
exactly.
then I would need that. Gotcha.
Particularly when you're on a tripod, because otherwise when you're hand holding, you've got the camera up to your eye.
Right.
Now, if you notice, my camera has an eye cup, which Brad's does not. This is an optional accessory. It does not come with the camera, but I strongly recommend it. It just gives you this extra cushion and kind of helps block out, again, extraneous light so that you're seeing exactly what you're trying to look at through the viewfinder. If we keep up to the top of the camera, along the back of it here, to the right side, there's another little dial that has a plus and a minus on it. If you pop that little button out, you have the ability to actually dial in a corrective diopter. Now, for people that wear eyeglasses, it can be pretty difficult looking through the viewfinder at times. Do you use a diopter correction on your camera?
It's one of those things that once you've said it, you don't think about it after you've said it the first time. So really, it's just whenever you first use your camera, you put your eye to it, twist it until you got it where you need it, and then you don't really do it again after that unless you share a camera with someone or somebody else uses it and they adjust it. But
That's right. Yeah, it's a one-time setting, and basically you pop it out, and you don't focus the camera and focus on the picture. What you do is, the critical thing here is that you want to be looking at those little etched focusing points on the focusing screen. Because if the camera's slightly off and you dial the diopter in, then everything's going to look sharp when it's really not.
Right.
So, pulling it out, you look at the etched focusing notches, the focusing points in the viewfinder, turn this till they're sharp, and then just depress it in one more time. And as Brad mentioned, you set that once and it's good to go until your eyes change.
Right.
Well, we've got a few more settings. Now, the next dial and button here on the camera, that covers both the metering and the exposure focus lock. We'll start with the metering first. If you start to the far left, you've got just a single dot. That's the spot meter setting in the camera. And basically what you're doing in spot metering is you're telling the camera to only meter off the selected focus point.
Okay.
So even if you're in manual focus, it's crucial that you have that focus point on your subject. But basically then the camera ignores all other light, meters only off your selected point, and you get a very, very fine metering system.
And one of the times that I found this very useful, as opposed to the next setting we're going to talk about, which I'm on most of the time, is whenever Joe, that I used to work for, he loves to shoot dance, and he took me to the New York Ballet, one of their practices, and the stage was set up, and the background was very dark, and they had a spotlight on the dancers, and they were really bright. So if I was on the next setting, the matrix metering, it was blowing out the dancers and making them really bright because it was metering for the entire scene. But so I switched over to spot and then had it focused on the dancers, and so it brought down the background to be much darker and
That's
metered for the dancers. So
perfect. And that's a really great example. That same thing would apply for people that attend concerts, for example, or just anything when you've got that really difficult lighting. And the matrix metering, which we're going to get to next, as Brad mentioned, is so amazing and so sophisticated. But if you've got incredibly difficult lighting and it's beyond the range that the camera can capture, it's up to you to take control and say, this is where I want you to meter, camera. Now, as Brad mentioned, I too am in matrix metering nearly all of the time. Matrix metering is a sophisticated, incredibly accurate system in these cameras. There's a 1,005 pixel matrix metering system in this camera. Now, what does that mean to you? The camera literally meters 1,005 different points in the viewfinder, takes them all, and in this incredibly huge database, goes through this system and says, wow, I see that there's a lot of sky and there's some foreground, and it takes into consideration the focus point, what your subject is, color contrast. And with the newer lenses, the D series and the G series, it also considers distance to subject. So all this stuff is happening and processing in just like a nanosecond. We don't have to stop and think. I use matrix metering nearly all the time because it is so incredibly accurate. When I want to add my own personal touch and creative control, that's when I will then dial in the exposure compensation to override that. The final setting on here is the center weighted metering. Now with center weighted metering, the camera is metering the entire area, but with a very strong emphasis in the center. And that's what cameras used to be in the past. They were always kind of based on center weighted before you had these options. That can be great if your subject is in the center. But as we know, it's not the best compositional situation. So I honestly don't really know too many people that use center weighted metering. I'm surprised it's actually still in the camera, but you can actually program in the weight of the center area as well. It can be anywhere from 8 to 20 millimeters, or you can even tell it to average, similar to matrix. But if you want the most sophisticated metering system, I suggest going into matrix metering.
Yep,
Cool.
I agree.
All right. Well, that same button, if you notice, it says AEL or AFL. Now what that is, and when we get into the menu, we'll talk about programming it, but this button in the default, if you're in a situation where you need to lock in an exposure, as you were talking about, say, the ballet, maybe these guys are dancing around on the stage, you're in spot meter, and you want to lock that exposure in as you're panning and tracking them, you can actually depress that button, and it will both lock the focus and the exposure so that you don't have to keep changing that on a quick-moving subject. It can be kind of useful for certain applications. The button next to that, it's called AF on. Now, that's a real handy button if you find you have a heavy shutter finger. What you can do with this is if you depress the button, it actually just focuses, and then you depress the shutter release so that it just fires the shutter. You can have the AF on set so that it totally disengages the shutter release, or you can just use it as a focusing tool, and then once your subject's in focus, depress the shutter release. That can be a pretty handy tool as well. Now, I've been talking about the main command dial, and that's this dial here at the back of the camera. We'll be using that a lot as we go through the menus. Let's continue on. We've now got what's called the multi-selector. Now, this is kind of command central in the camera. This is where you select which focus point that you want to activate. It's how you cycle through the menus and decide which menu item you want. As you notice, it's this little rocker switch, and you can move left to right or even diagonally. With so many focus points, you want to be able to move quickly from one to the other. So you simply just select which focus point you want through your multi-selector, or again, in the menu settings, that's how we cycle through to get to them. Then you have a center button here in the multi-selector. The default on that is to put your focus point right back to center, and or you can program it for activating your meter or keeping the meter on longer.
You can program for a number of different things.
That's right, which when we get into the menus, we'll discuss all of those.
You can also use it to scroll through your images whenever you're reviewing them on the playback menu, and sit there and hit the buttons. The other kind of cool thing is you can use the main command dial to scroll through the images as well. So that's also a handy feature.
Thanks for bringing that up. I don't think many people know that feature. Yeah. That's very cool. Now, while we're on that multifunction and playback, not only can you scroll back and forth through the images, but if you go up and down, you're getting the image or you're getting the exposure information or the shooting data, as well as the highlight setting. And in fact, let's just take a look at the highlight setting. I'm going to depress the playback button and then scroll through the different settings so that you can see what I'm talking about. There is one final little setting here that's involved with the multi-selector, and you'll notice there's a little dot or an L. You have the ability to actually lock that multi-selector. Oftentimes when you want to select a specific focus point and there's the possibility that you could bump that, if you lock that, then the focus point is not changeable. However, that also locks the multi-selector from your menu or your playback settings, so I keep mine on unless there's a specific situation where I know I want to lock everything and not inadvertently activate something using that.
Think of it as an on-off switch for that specific multi-switch.
Perfect, yes. We've got some additional focusing options down here. We talked about single and continuous focus, but the way the camera actually focuses on the scene or the subject can be controlled down here with your AF selector. Now, the first one is called Auto Area Autofocus. That's a very cool feature in that the camera is going to automatically detect the subject. How it does that, I don't know. With G and D series lenses, it's really cool because it even has this capability of detecting a person. So again, back into that incredible database and processor, the camera is going to detect what the subject is and lock focus. Now, if you're in single focus, it's going to indicate which focus point it has selected for you. If you're in continuous focus, it's not, because it's just going to keep things in focus. In addition to working really well with people, it's a great feature too when you're shooting like birds in flight or something against a neutral background, because it's real easy for it to sense the subject. Now, the next one down, that's where I have my camera set most of the time. That's called Dynamic Area Autofocus. What happens is the camera, it lets me select which focus point I want, but then as I'm tracking my subject and panning with it, if that subject moves out of my selected focus point briefly, the camera will automatically search the surrounding focus points, keeping my subject in focus, allowing me to capture a sequence of images. It's very cool. And you have the ability, once we get into the menu, we'll show you, to select just how many of those focus points are going to be active when you're in the dynamic setting. So you can either expand it anywhere from 11 points clear out to the full 51 point AF. I tend to keep mine at 21 most of the time, but that's something that you can, again, change at any time through the menu. The final setting is just single focus point selector. And again, you go back to your multi-selector, you select the focus point, the camera will stay locked on that focus point until you make the change yourself. Gives you full control. That's better for stationary subjects than moving subjects. Well, we've just got one more button left here on the back of the camera, and that's the info button. That's a really cool button because what it does is when you depress the info button, it gives you a big, large display of all your camera settings here on the back of the screen. There's additional features, though, that are very cool about that. And one is, if I hit the info button and then I hit it a second time, it brings up what's called the quick menu or quick settings. And Nikon has determined some of the most used menu items and put them down here at the bottom of the rear display. I can cycle through anything from active D-lighting, my color space, bracketing settings, and then I just simply hit the multi-selector, the center button, and that kicks me straight into the menu to that particular setting. It's a real quick way of not having to scroll through all the different menus to get to some of your favorite settings.
That is very handy, and I just learned something new because I had no idea that was there.
Awesome. There's a lot about these cameras. And the thing to keep in mind is we're covering everything today.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to know more than you probably want to know about these cameras, but it's great to go through your instruction manual, to review this video over and over, and at least get a sense of what the camera can do. You're going to find that you don't use very many of these features at all, but it's great to know that, hey, this camera can do multiple exposures. There may come a time somewhere down the road that you're going to say, hey, I want to try that out. And at least you know where that is or that it's capable of that.
Yep.
Next, we're going to get more in depth into the menu. So let's move on.